So I have a kind of an embarrassing revelation to make. I gave a talk in this symposium 4 years ago, and I had the same title of today. So the good thing is that in the meanwhile, I put together a research team, got a big grant from the ERC, and managed to do some research on the topic. And so the interest in this theme, the relationship between ethno-racial diversity and levels of prosociality and social capital, started out years ago with some sort of deep unsatisfaction with a lot of research that was coming out that it identified a negative association between ethnic heterogeneity at the community level and the various indicators of collective outcomes: self-reported trust, political participation, social capital. The most famous study in this area is this paper by Putnam, in which he concludes that in ethnically diverse neighborhoods, residents of all races tend to hunker down like a turtle, trust, even if one's own race is lower, altruism and community cooperation rarer, friends fewer. Very dramatic conclusions based essentially on observational evidence that wasn't very strong. And in fact, like other studies that were a bit more serious in terms of the type of behavioral outcomes they used, or used the measures of ethnic and economic compositions, already found less dramatic conclusions. In particular, with respect to these observational studies, there are two compositional effects that were popping up quite often. One I highlighted in a paper with Maria Bascal, which is reanalyzing the Putnam's data, and it's the idea that essentially ethno-racially diverse communities are communities where by default there are more minorities. And minorities, especially blacks and Hispanics in the US, tends to report lower level of self-reported trust. If you put the two things together, you have lower level of trust, but it's not because diversity has lowered the levels of trust, but because the people coming in, composing, making up these neighborhoods, come in with different levels. The other classical compositional effect have to do with the fact that very often diverse communities are also poor communities. And therefore studies that seriously controlled for socioeconomic conditions and deprivation found essentially no effect or reduced the effects of alleged diversity. So I could have simply stopped here, just saying, okay, the observational evidence is poor for this relationship between ethno-racial diversity and levels of prosociality and cooperation. But I found the topic in itself interesting and the underlying question interesting. So the first observation here was, why do people just jump on this conclusion? Why they were so tuned to believe that as you increase the ethnic diversity of the place, you might have lower levels of prosociality. And that's because most of us carry this communitarian conception of social capital and prosociality, which is based on homogeneity and similarity. And the basic idea is cohesive groups and closing networks facilitate the emergence of trust, reciprocity, shared norms, and this is all true. The bottom line, however, is that we don't live in this type of societies anymore. We still manage to get along. So my starting point was, how does prosociality emerges in complex society that are characterized by differentiation, heterogeneity, individualization, organic solidarity a la Durkheim. Today we seem to be talking about Durkheim a lot. And the basic question became, how do individuals manage to transcend small group boundaries and develop solidarity and cooperation toward some sort of generalized other? Now, when you switch from studying homogeneous to heterogeneous groups, you start asking slightly different questions about cooperation. So first of all, a set of questions, and here I'm going to essentially give you some sort of outline of a bunch of research that I've done on the topic in the past few years, and then I'm going to dive into one of them. So one set of questions that arise is that you have to start distinguishing between in-group and out-group dynamics, and distinguishing between how people behave toward members of their cohesive, close-knit networks, their ethnic group, their religious group, and either generalized others or members of the out-group. So one study we did to address these type of questions was a study in which we asked, what's the effect of out-group exposure, first-time out-group exposure, by looking at a large set of communities in Eastern Germany that for the first time received refugees in 2015. These were communities that didn't have more than 1% of immigrants, mostly from Poland, before then. And all of a sudden, they found themselves receiving these refugees, and the allocation of refugees by the German government was more or less random. So what we did was to sample communities that received refugees, match them with communities that were extremely similar in terms of sociodemographics, support for right-wing parties, and then, once we had these matches, we sampled people from this community, contacted them via phone, and tried to get them online to participate to a series of activity and take a survey. So the idea was to actually compare people who had the first-hand experience with immigrants, refugees, and people who did not, but that were very similar beforehand. And the funny thing that we found, this very solid, robust finding, is that there is no difference in their attitudes and voting behavior and behavior in behavioral games. Another study that I did around this topic, but more at the macro level, was to try to figure out what explains variation in levels of prosocial behavior across different communities, and what is the relationship between in-group and out-group prosociality. And in this case, what I did was to exploit the large variation in prosocial behavior in Italy by running a large-scale loss letter experiment using a national representative sample of communities. And I randomized the identity of a letter recipient so I could actually test whether rates of return for Italians were similar or different from rates of return for immigrants. And in this case, the underlying question was whether we observed forms of generalized altruism where essentially altruism toward in-group go hand in hand with altruism toward the out-group, or whether there is a trade-off as in parochial altruism theories. And I found strong support for generalized altruism in this case, at least. A second set of questions have to do with the fact that when we study ethno-racial diversity, we also want to take into account that there are underlying structures of social differentiations that have to do with social hierarchy. And the classical observation here is that immigrants or minorities are often also low income, and therefore their status on the social ladder might actually be determined as much by their ethnicity as by their level of social status. So we did, for instance, some online experiments fielding a new cooperative investment game to compare the behavior toward rich or poor, blacks or white alters. So the idea here is to test whether people are more or less cooperative toward another person, depending on whether depending on the person's race and their income and the mix of the two. What we found here is actually that level of cooperations are lower when people are matched with poor individuals, and there is a racial penalty, at least on NTERC, only if a person is poor. So if you are matched in this game with a poor black, there is an additional penalty compared to being matched with poor white. But if you're matched with a black person who is rich, your behavior toward that person is exactly the same as the behavior toward a rich white person. And then I filled a bunch of field experiments in which what we tried to nail were microdynamics of interpersonal relationships that kind of build and reproduce discrimination. And here again, we varied the ethnicity and the social status by changing like how people are dressed of our confederates. And here I'm just like showing images from two of these field experiments. One is a field experiment in a subway setting in which we study whether like people coming into the subway are more or less likely to sit in a situation in which there is an immigrant, and whether like the way the immigrant is dressed affects that. And here is another experiment in which instead we studied like little signs of social difference by looking at whether cars stop at the crosswalk. As you probably know, Italians don't like to follow rules, so cars don't stop at the crosswalk. And we studied whether there were different rates of stops as a function of the identity of the passersby, both as a function of the ethnicity and the way they dressed. Now, the third set of questions have to do instead with the type of interactions we are interested in, and whether natives and immigrants behave in different ways in different types of interaction. Here I tend to distinguish mainly between strategic and non-strategic interactions, where non-strategic are simply acts of solidarity that don't entail any direct consideration about what others will do. So for instance, if you donate clothes to immigrants, you don't even have to interact with them. But definitely, like your own welfare is not affected by what others would do. Well, if you actually hire an immigrant, you enter in a type of interaction that is strategic in the sense that your evaluation of whether to hire this person is a function of what you expect this person will do. And the second step is on this set of interactions, we want to identify which type of social dilemma they capture, and then see which mechanisms work in order to make it possible for people to overcome possible collective action problems. So sanctioning, networks, communication, and so on. And to study these type of questions, what we did is to run a series of lab in the field behavioral games with a representative sample of Italian natives and immigrants in Milan, changing both the compositions of these groups, like we had some homogeneous groups, all Moroccans or Italians and so on, or heterogeneous groups in which there were components of two nationalities, and play different games and different variants of games. And this is like the type of study, the study I'm going to focus on in the last few minutes to just give you a sense of how this unfolded. With Maria Pascal, we are essentially planning a similar design, sampling people from New York City, where we can exploit also the very different variation in terms of like socio-demographic composition of the neighborhoods. New York City is spectacular in that case. So here's the study design in Milan. So what we did here is to select people that come from diverse neighborhoods, which are defined as neighborhoods in Milan that have an immigration over 12%, and they are quite different in terms of socio-demographics. There are also some of the central parts of the city. We actually got a representative sample of Italians and a group of Filipinos and Moroccans. And the two general goals were to essentially do an X-ray of prosocial behavior in different intergroup dynamics, and the second was to study the mechanisms that affect cooperation using different games and variation over the games. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly the X-ray part, but I have, of course, findings about the other as well. So, of course, there is plenty of studies of intergroup dynamics and theories about it. So the one group of theories, and the theories that are usually used the most in this type of literature on interracial relationships, more or less use the distinction in terms of behavior toward in and out group. If you think about the classical studies on prejudice from conflict and contact theories, as well as more recent studies on parochial altruism, they all are based on the idea of behavior toward in and out group. But also most studies of discrimination that have looked at discrimination through the lenses of ethnicities, they are also thinking in terms of in and out group dynamics. There is, however, a research tradition that was quite popular in the past, and the most prominent example in my mind is this paper from the 30s from Black and Black, in which they asked kids in a kindergarten class to choose dolls. And they had available black and white dolls, and both black and white kids chose the white dolls. It's actually an approach to the study of intergroup dynamics that takes into account social hierarchies and how groups are not simply defined as black or white, but they are stuck in society in terms of power, access to resources, and so on. And this approach is actually quite meaningful to explain some of our results. Now, what did we do that is slightly different from previous studies? So, first of all, we actually try to go beyond one-way interactions, in the sense that most studies on these topics look at the behavior of natives or whites toward minorities or blacks and so on, while actually we did study behavior toward multiple ethnic groups. So we don't have only one group of immigrants, but several, representing different nationalities. And then we also tried to study the behavior of ethnic groups toward of immigrants toward Italians. So we did sample Moroccans and Filipinos. The second thing that we did was to distinguish between non-strategic prosocial behavior and strategic interaction, as I mentioned before. And here we are going to rely on 3 different games. One is the dictator game, and the second, capturing strategic interaction. The second group of games are a trust game and a competence game. The last thing that we did in the design was to try to build on a finding that is very common in observational research, which is that essentially in most studies that relate ethno-racial diversity to negative outcomes, people find that if individuals have networks that are diverse, the attitudes toward our group, the levels of cooperation are all more positive. So essentially, the negative effect of diversity is mediated by the fact that people don't have diverse friends. While if you do have contact with people from different groups, then the negative effect of diversity is not there, and sometimes we find even positive outcomes. So, of course, when you look at observational data, you cannot tell whether this process of having more positive collective outcomes through contact with out-group individuals is due to the contact itself or to some sort of selection issue. So people who are more prone to be open and tolerant are more likely to self-select into diverse neighborhoods, are more likely to have a network of people who who is more diverse. So we cannot nail using observational data whether the process of selection into certain type of relationships, rather the experiences of these relationships per se, is the cause of greater levels of cooperation with outgroup members. But in an experimental setting, we can do something like this. And what we did was not to randomly assign people to relationships, but what we did was to actually allow, in a subset of situations, games, individuals to select the person they were paired with, instead of simply stacking them into a relationship, to be clearer when I explain it. So let's move on to the first set of results. So we brought in these people, and first of all of them were asked to participate in a dictator game, which is a situation in which people have to divide an amount of money, 10 euros, between themselves and someone else. And our participants were paired, in this case, with someone who had participated before into our study. They were all taking this survey on a computer. They were paired with an in-group member, someone from their own ethnic group, and with an out-group member. This is how they behave. This is how much Italians gave to in-group and out-group. Same for Filipinos and Moroccans. So we don't really find a lot of differences in contributions in a classical measure of prosocial behavior like the dictator game. And even when we break down for Italians the different ethnicities of their people they were matched with, we don't find differences as well. And here, like, it was important for us to look at different ethnicities because there are different stereotypes about these ethnic groups and so on. So then we moved on to a series of strategic games where essentially when people interact, they have to take into account how the other person will behave. Well, here is just an act of generosity. In the next set of games is more like entering an interaction that has consequences on your own well-being. It's like hiring someone or like sending kids to the same school. You are really your benefits are going to depend on what others would do. So the first set of games are a bunch of trust games. In a trust game, in this case, we are going to look at the first mover. So individuals are paired with someone else. Both receive 10 euros, and the first mover has to decide how much to give to the other person. The amount gets trebled, and then the other person can decide how much to send back. Here, the situation the individuals were presented with was like this. You've been paired with, and then there is a name of someone who was born in, and then like nationality, an age, and then we actually provided information about what this person does in life, whether he likes to watch TV, works in elderly care, whether he works on a factory floor, and so on. And the idea here was that if we just tell people, you know, you're matched with a Moroccan, they would rely on all sorts of stereotypes they have about this person, or this group. It's inevitable. They don't have any other information. But when you actually interact with people, you are matched with people that have a job or don't have a job, a gender, and so on. So what we are trying to build here is a situation in which they are paired with an actual person rather than just a stereotype of an ethnic category. And here's what the results are from this series of games. So essentially, here we are estimating coefficients in terms of contributions. There is no discrimination in terms of how much people give when paired to these different nationalities. The default is Italian. While we do find, as we expected, differences in terms of what people do in life. So the baseline here is whether the person likes to watch TV or go on walks, so it's very neutral, kind of passive activity. And then the other category is whether like they volunteered in a church or mosque, had a factory job, elderly care, or were class representatives in their kids' school. And the findings suggesting that essentially there is a premium for engagement in some sort of activity that is positive and meaningful, but there is no ethnic discrimination. Now, in a subgroup of participants, before having them do the trust game, we asked them to select the person they wanted to play with. And they all had two choices. A default choice, which was an Italian who loves to watch TV or go on walks, and someone else that was randomly assigned, which could be both an Italian or an immigrant, and then like one of the forms of civic engagement you saw before. So before entering the interaction, they can choose whether to do it with one or the other person. And here's the results. When given the possibility of choosing, Italians are, these are only Italians, are less likely to choose an immigrant. So here we do find some evidence of discrimination, and definitely more likely to choose people who are engaged in some sort of meaningful activities like volunteering in the church or mosque and participating to the PTA and so on. Then we moved on and said, okay, so this is a strategic interaction that involves trust. Let's now think about other types of interactions that are meaningful in the life of both immigrants and Italians. And there are a lot of situations in which Italians essentially end up hiring or working with immigrants. So the second type of interaction has to do with competence. Individuals are asked to participate to this activity, which is a logical activity, and they are told that if both themselves and the person they are paired with are gonna solve this logical puzzle correctly, they are going to make 6 euros. But they both need to get it right. And then we ask them to choose who they wanna do this activity with. And again, in the choice, they have an Italian who works in a supermarket, this is a default for everybody, or an Italian or an immigrant that either likes to watch TV or is a teacher. So the teacher here is conveying the idea of competence, the type of competence you need to solve that task. So any reasonable person is given the possibility to go for a teacher. That's our expectation. And in fact, this is what we do find. There is still like a penalty for being an immigrant, but definitely like when people have a competence, they are picked. Now we broke down this a bit more, and we looked at the interaction between being an immigrant and having the qualification of a teacher. Here the default is being an Italian and watching TV. So there is no difference between being an Italian or an immigrant who watches TV. But definitely, if you're an immigrant and you're a teacher, you're preferred largely, a lot more than an Italian who watches TV. But the advantage of being a teacher is stronger for the Italian. And this is for the entire population, both Italians and immigrants that participated. Now we break it down by ethnic group. So we ask, are Italians going for other Italians or giving a better, greater advantage to Italian teacher? Or also immigrants doing the same. And what we find is essentially that both Italians and immigrants definitely prefer the immigrant that is a teacher over an Italian who is watching TV all day, but they also both give a greater advantage to an Italian who is a teacher. Which changes a bit like our expectations in terms of discrimination, in the sense that in our interpretation, this is not so much a story about in-group and out-group. Because if it was a story about in-group and out-group, we would actually see immigrants giving an advantage to an immigrant. This was always an immigrant of their own nationality over an Italian, but we don't see that. We do actually instead see a story that is more similar to the classical story of social difference and status hierarchies. that has been told many times about women, for instance. So in fact, when we actually look at the advantage that women have over men, we find the same pattern. So essentially, when we look at whether people prefer a woman teacher over a male who watches TV, of course they go for a woman who is a teacher. But then, like, the men have a much greater advantage. And this is happening, again, both within male respondents and female respondents. So it's a Cecilia Ridgway type of story in which essentially what people are doing in preferring some individuals over others is partly based on how they perceive these individuals being on a social hierarchy. And ethnicity is part of that social hierarchy, along with a bunch of other characteristics. Yes?
Can we have some time for discussion?
Yeah, absolutely, and done.
Yeah.
So, just as a conclusion, where I'm going with these results, but a bunch of other things that I can also mention, is that essentially in the Durkheimian understanding of organic solidarity, he's actually saying that when we are in a situation of organic solidarity, we are really dealing with the division of labor where essentially individuals do not resemble one another, but they are different from one another. And that's what determines like their position in the social structure. Okay.
So we have time for
yeah, sorry, I saw 15 minutes. Okay. Fine, go ahead. So, okay, go ahead.
Discussion. Anybody has questions?
Okay.
So one observation on the Ridgway thing is that the fact that it's about competence may be important because status expectation states theory really is about judgments of competence rather than but I wanted to ask you if you I don't know if you tried to vary this, but at least in the U.S. with survey experiments there is a lot of evidence emerging that certain kinds of people with particular political or racial ideologies are much more responsive to subliminal cues than people who aren't. So if you did the study, say, in a place where the League of the North was very strong, do you think you might get different results than if you do it in Rome?
Not so much. I would say not so much. We do have variation in terms of party orientation, party preference, and so on. And yeah, definitely it's working the way you would expect it. But I won't say that's the driver.
But there are two different levels, right? There's the individual level effect, but then there's the aggregate effect of community preponderance of a particular thing.
Yeah, although anti-immigrant sentiment is diffused across party supporters in Italy. So it's less of a partisan thing. There is an element, and it might actually build on the localities at the community level. It might express itself even more, both at the institutional level as well as individual. But I wouldn't say that that's not the driver. It's much deeper than that, at least from the data, both here and in Germany, actually.
We have time for one more question, and otherwise.
Yeah. Okay. I apologize for being too long.
Short question. Are the choices rational?
What do you mean by rational?
Are the Italians more trustworthy? In the trust game, there's a second player.
You mean like how they behave? They behave like standard people, yes. I mean, the trends and so on, distributions are very, very comparable to what you find in other settings. Yeah.
So I was wondering about the relative status of people who are playing this game. You know, is there any setting where they had to, consider themselves with respect to the other, and how that, if you're relatively deprived with respect to the other group, then your perception of the group might differ. So it's interesting that you didn't find any discrimination on many of these measures. But if you felt like your status was being diminished by the existence of the others, does that affect?
So this is the reason why this set of activities were performed with an alter that wasn't present in the room.
Okay.
but was instead like someone described on the screen.
Yeah.
While we have another set of activities which are more like group-based public goods games and so on, that are indeed like with the other 5 people that are present in the room. And there are these considerations as well as other considerations like the Muslim woman like wearing a veil or not are factoring in. But like one of the decision we made, this was deliberate, was not to have these like pairwise activities with people that were physically present because of some of these considerations.
So I was struck by your last result about the effect sizes of immigrant teachers versus Italian teachers, and I always worry a little bit about claims based on effects being different relative to another baseline, right? So you're comparing both of them to the Italian who likes watching TV, but making an inference about the difference between Italian teachers and
They're
immigrant
also
teachers. So you actually
Yeah, we did test that. Like we didn't show it in that graph. That graph is exactly what you're.
But you didn't
thinking
actually.
about.
Did you do an experiment in which there was a choice between the two?
We did, like statistically, you can also test whether that difference that we find is statistically significant in itself. By basing your inferences
Right.
on the subgroup of participants that were assigned to either one.
They didn't look. They had overlapping error bars, right?
But that error bar is for the comparison to the baseline, okay? But then you can also do tests for comparisons within other pairs, and that's what we did. Like, so we do have statistics for this, and they are significant for Italians, they are significant for Moroccans. For Filipinos, where we have fewer, is not significant at the 95%, but is significant at like lower P. But it seems to be robust. But your point should be like, if your point is like, to nail it, I want to see an experiment in which I really have that comparison as the comparison.
Right. Where the
I thought those error bars were confusing as well, so it's just
No, it's hard to.
a
It's hard to-
point
yeah, that's
of
okay.
clarification.
Yeah. So, good.
When you selected this person, that means there is an effect in that, because they didn't get paid. Those who were not selected, they didn't get any money.
In this case, it was a.
Because it means that when someone is selected, if the other guy is not paid, it means that there is a form of donation aspect, that they expect the payments to another group, which actually might diminish the effect of your results, because you usually want to contribute to people being poor. That you have a lot of experimental results showing that. So not choosing an immigrant would be that this immigrant doesn't have the chance of receiving or being part of the game. It's an effect that
It's a possibility, although if you think about the results from a dictator game where people on average are likely to give the same amount to both in-group and out-group, you might assume that they are less inclined to make this type of distinctions. So I would use that. I can even control for it, but I'm pretty sure it's not gonna play a role here.
I have a question for my fellow panelists, both of them, about the role of sampling in your studies. So you both made it a case that, getting out of the lab and interacting with different groups of people was really beneficial. There's a result in survey research that people who are more likely to be in volunteer organizations are also more likely to respond to surveys. So certain kinds of things can be overestimated when you have non-response. And so I'm wondering, for certain kinds of things like generosity and cooperation, this might potentially be related to non-response in your survey or your recruitment process. So I'm wondering how you think about that possibility.
Should we go first? In my case, so we did work hard. There are two situations in which we really went all the way in order to get a representative sample, the German study and this one I presented. And in both cases, we actually bounded the marketing company that was recruiting the people to strata of the population. So of course we didn't sample on participation in voluntary groups, but we tried to lock in like enough female, enough young enough, high income, and so on. So we address that slightly indirectly this way. Then like most of these comparisons we do in the analysis sort of are oblivious to this, because we are not really talking about about estimating generosity in the population in general. I'm making comparisons. So let's say I might be overestimating generosity or other stuff, but I'm comparing people in communities that received to people in communities that did not receive, and that's my comparison. So that might be going on, but it's not going to affect my estimate in the same this case. So it affects more like studies in which you are really going for an average, for a behavior, rather than comparison with